conversation with you. Yeah. I feel like I've entered into heaven when I'm with your presence.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Adam McGill. I'm a deacon and assistant minister here at the Renaissance Church of Christ in Atlanta, Georgia. And the elders and Brother Hayward, in their wisdom, have decided to create a kind of hall of fame, a hall of history, helping to showcase the history of the West End and now the Renaissance Church of Christ. So in this hall, in this presentation, what I'm going to be doing is walking you through the first ministers, the first preachers here at Renaissance, formerly the West End Church of Christ. And we cannot really start looking at the history of West End / Renaissance without talking about Dr. Daniel Hook. Now here's why Dr. Hook is so important. Dr. Hook is the one who came to Georgia and planted dozens and dozens of churches of Christ, not just in Georgia, but actually in the Southeast, to include Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina even. So Dr. Hook is the reason why the churches of Christ even came to Atlanta in the first place. So this is around the middle of the 19th century, 1851, 1852. Even though actually he did start doing work as early as the 1830s. But in terms of Church of Christ in Atlanta, for us, 1851, 1852. Now something interesting started to happen though. Is that while he was planting churches of Christ in Atlanta, there was actually a split within the Christian church. This split resulted in Christian churches and churches of Christ. So we say Church of Christ today as if it was always one thing. It always wasn't. It was the Christian church that we broke away from. So there were some Christian churches here that remain a part of the Christian church, and others renamed themselves Churches of Christ. The split was over instrumental music. So there were actually still some Christian churches that no longer or forbade the use of instrumental music, but retained the title of Christian church. But all Churches of Christ forbade the use of instrumental music. So when we start talking about the first Church of Christ here in Atlanta, that does not mean the gospel wasn't here already. The gospel was here before the Church of Christ was. How could that be? Through the Christian church from the 1830s to the 1850s as spread by Dr. Daniel Hook, who was an associate of Dr. Alexander Campbell. So what does that mean? He preached, hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. The gospel message as we in the Church of Christ understand it. So as we leave Dr. Daniel Hook, a compatriot, a companion of Alexander Campbell, we then move on looking at the Churches of Christ in Atlanta, and we come to O.D. Bearden. Now, why is O.D. Bearden significant? O.D. Bearden is significant because what he's going to do is he's going to have a gospel meeting here in Atlanta. The significance of that gospel meeting, which was actually a tent meeting, wasn't that a lot of people were brought into the Church of Christ. Very few were. But what's so significant about what O.D. Bearden did was it helped to coalesce. It helped for all the members of the body of Christ, Churches of Christ in Atlanta, come together at this tent meeting. Once they all got in contact with each other, they realized, you know what? We need a church here in the city of Atlanta. And so through O.D. Bearden, we get the beginnings, the start of the West End Church of Christ. When he conducted this tent meeting and all these people from around the Metroplex area, the Metro Atlanta area, came together, saw each other face to face, were able to start planning and thinking, strategizing about building something more permanent here in Atlanta. From O.D. Bearden, we then move on to the actual first minister of the West End Church of Christ, who's going to be S.H. Hall. S.H. Hall is going to be, again, the first minister of the West End Church of Christ. And so one thing I think that's also important is that all these men are coming out of Tennessee. So of course, the Alexander Stone, the Campbell Stone movement, Alexander Campbell, all came out of Tennessee with maybe parts of Kentucky thrown in there. So all these men are coming out of, as it were, the birthplace of the Church of Christ in America. Of course, we know the church started through Jesus Christ. But the Church of Christ in America came out of Tennessee. So all of these men are coming out of Tennessee. All of these men are also going to be men of their times. What does that mean? That means their understanding of the gospel, understanding of the Bible, is going to be through reading and studying it themselves. One thing I think is also exceptional is that all of these men were really big on evangelism. What do you mean? So 165 baptisms from S.H. Hall, right? We're going to have, again, multiple people baptized through O.D. Bearden. So what's happening in Atlanta and through West End is the church is growing. And a lot of these men are going to be in contact through the Gospel Advocate. So as we move on from S.H. Hall, the first official minister of the West End Church of Christ, we then move on now to the second official minister of the West End Church of Christ, B.C. Goodpasture. It is through B.C. Goodpasture that West End will grow to 600 members. And so B.C. Goodpasture, again, is also from Tennessee. And he is also going to be an editor for the Gospel Advocate. One thing I think is also important is that all these men, not only are they from Tennessee, but they also knew each other. So you're going to see a lot of overlap with the Gospel Advocate, with preaching on the same circuit, with them reaching out. And even when they leave here, some go back to Tennessee, some continue preaching other pastors, that all of these men are from the same era, the same time frame, and the same understanding of what it is and what it means to be a Christian. One thing about B.C. Goodpasture, a lot of people are going to remember and know him because he was a huge proponent of literacy and reading. He donated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books to Freed Hardeman. They actually had a free B.C. Goodpasture Day at Freed Hardeman because he donated so much. He was literally the editor of the Gospel Advocate until his dying day. What I mean by that is he returned home from work and had a stroke in his driveway and then died the next day. So B.C. Goodpasture was a man, as many of these men are, who believed in continuing in the field, continuing the work with your very last breath. So he died in 1977, B.C. Goodpasture, the second official minister of the West End Church of Christ. From him, we'll move on to our third minister, Clyde Hale. And Clyde Hale is also going to be incredibly significant for even our modern understanding of the West End Church of Christ. Clyde Hale. Clyde Hale, and by the way, these numbers up here represent the time they served as ministers here at the West End Church of Christ. So Clyde Hale, again, also from Tennessee. Clyde Hale did something very interesting. Two things I would say. One, the building that became the West End Church of Christ, he was the first minister of that building. The previous ministers served as members of the preachers of the West End Church of Christ, but at different locations. What does that mean? They did not yet have the permanent building that we know of as the West End Church of Christ. They were at other locations, even house churches. Clyde Hale will be the first minister at the former location of the West End Church of Christ. That's the first thing that makes him noteworthy. But the second thing I think that makes him really noteworthy is he is going to bring in Marshall Keeble. So Marshall Keeble, he will invite to preach at the West End Church of Christ. Now, why is that important? Because up to this point, 1931, there were no African American black members of the Churches of Christ in Atlanta. So everyone we talked about before this, none of them had black membership within the Churches of Christ. That is why Clyde Hale is really going to be a forerunner to how West End became the West End in a Renaissance we know it as today. So he invites Marshall Keeble, who of course baptized tens of thousands. But here in Atlanta, he's going to baptize more than 2,000 African American members in Atlanta, Marshall Keeble. So what's going to happen is, for the first time, you're going to have a black population of Christians in Atlanta who identify as members of the Church of Christ. Clyde Hale, the third minister at the West End Church of Christ. From him, move on to number 4, Howard Allen, which we'll be very brief with, because unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about Howard Allen in terms of before he got here and after he got here. One thing I will say is through research, he continued in the ministry, he continued in the faith, he continued preaching. We just don't know all that he went and all that he did. What we can say is he did take up the work at the Catoma Street Church of Christ in Montgomery, which is a very old and historical Church of Christ in Montgomery. He did continue there until 1950, but after that, we're not quite sure of what happened. So from number 4, Howard Allen, move on then to number 5, Franklin T. Puckett. Now, Franklin T. Puckett is going to be one of the first, if not the first minister who was not from Tennessee. By Tennessee, I'm really saying born and raised. Puckett's going to be from Arkansas. And so he will also be evangelistic preacher. He will go and preach throughout the Southeast. He's going to be a Greek and Hebrew expert teacher and scholar. And he'll do a lot of work in the various college, university churches of Christ. But I do think it is noteworthy to say this, is that the time frame in which Franklin T. Puckett lived, at least in terms of the time frame in which he taught here, 4751, he will go on, especially through the 60s, and he will, it's online actually, have a paper entitled The Messiah and Racial Problems, in which he talks about Christianity and the civil rights movement. And his belief is going to be that black people should not agitate to leave the position that they're in. And so he is, as many of these men were, segregationist. They were not integrationist and did not believe in equality with the races. If we go all the way back to the founder, Dr. Hook. Dr. Hook was a Confederate. I mean, like literally a Confederate. He supported the Confederacy. His sons were Confederate officers. And so if you go even back to O.D. Bearden, the money that came for building the first structure for the Western Church of Christ was given by a former Confederate officer. So when we talk about, what were their stances, these men were products of their time in the Deep South. They were Confederates, they were neo-Confederates, they were white supremacists, they were segregationists. And so what is remarkable is that the roots of the Western Church of Christ came about through men who would have despised the demographics that you see here today, which shows you God, that God allowed Confederates to plant a church. And he allowed Confederates and Confederate sympathizers to recruit the people that they held in disdain. All that is God. So Franklin T. Puckett, the 5th minister at the Western Church of Christ. We then move on to number 6, J. Edward Nolan. J. Edward Nolan, again, goes back to Tennessee, right? Born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. J. Edward Nolan is going to be another preacher coming out of Tennessee. He will replace, of course, Franklin T. Puckett. He's also a writer for the Gospel Guardian, and he is going to be a prolific writer and prolific preacher and teacher. J. Edward Nolan will then make way for A.R. Hill beginning in 1958. A.R. Hill, he will be the 7th minister at the Western Church of Christ. And so what's interesting again is how all these men knew each other. So he will preach the gospel for 62 years. And he was a child and he heard F.W. Smith preach. Who's F.W. Smith? F.W. Smith is the first minister, official minister at the Western Church of Christ. So even though he's the 7th minister, he knew and heard the first minister who preached at the West End. So all of these men were evangelistic. All these men, most of them coming out of Tennessee, all these men were products of their time. And so they did the best they could with what they knew. The one thing they did do was grow the church, grow the church, grow the church. And that's an ethos you will see that we even have today of being evangelistic and planting and seeding God's churches. And A.R. Hill will then lead to J.V. Copeland, who will be a pivotal preacher in the history of the West End Church of Christ. J.V. Copeland, he will be the minister here at West End for roughly 9 years. And so J.V. Copeland is going to be the minister here in the early 60s through the early 70s. Why should I strike a chord with you? It should strike a chord because you're talking about desegregation. So as the desegregation occurs, something's going to happen called white flight. And that is when a lot of the white population, because of fear of the black population moving in, would then flee to further flung out suburbs. I say further flung out, but not all that far. College Park, right? Today is not considered a far-flung suburb, but back then it was. They would flee to places like College Park. So during his ministry, West End would actually come down in terms of membership to roughly 100 people. From 600 in his heyday down to 100. What happened? People fled the West End Church of Christ because West End, the neighborhood, was desegregating. So what did J.V. Copeland do? Unlike a lot of his compatriots who sold off the property, sold the building, pocketed the money, and went started a church near where they were, J.V. Copeland instead stayed put at West End. And not only did he stay put, he went and recruited a minister by the name of Wesley R. Brown, because he believed that no matter where you were located, the people needed to hear the gospel message. And so he is responsible, J.V. Copeland, for bringing in Wesley R. Brown. He's the minister, later on elder, and he'll move on to Forest Park Church of Christ as he got older and was able to travel, that even today there are those who remember J.V. Copeland. Wesley R. Brown. So there's all kinds of irony built in to Wesley R. Brown being the 9th minister at the West End Church of Christ. What kind of irony? He's the 9th minister, the first black minister, and the longest serving minister. That the longest serving minister at the West End Church of Christ was the first black minister. Not only was he the longest serving minister, he grew West End into 1,300 person congregation, which was the largest West End had ever been up to that time. So what does that mean? That means this man, who was married to Barbara Brown, and his wife Barbara Brown was baptized by Marshall Keeble. See how this kind of all connects? So his wife was baptized by Marshall Keeble, who was also brought into West End by a former minister, Southwest Christian College graduate. He also, when he first started attending West End, had sit in the balcony. They didn't even let him sit along with some other members who are still here today. They didn't let him sit in the main auditorium. They sit in the balcony. So this is the man that came in, that grew West End, brought incredible stability to West End, and oversaw the transition from a majority white population congregation to a majority black Church of Christ congregation. And as he stepped off the scene, in came our 10th and current minister, Orpheus J. Hayward. As of this year, he will be the 2nd longest serving minister at the Renaissance / West End Church of Christ, behind Wesley R. Brown. Not only will he be the 2nd longest serving minister, he will then grow the 1,300 from Wesley R. Brown into 2,000 plus that we have today. So it is incredibly ironic that when you look at the history of the West End Church of Christ, and you look at all the men who came forward and where they came from, and we talked about how so many of those men were from Tennessee. With Wesley R. Brown, you have a man who was born in Baltimore. With Orpheus J. Hayward, a man born in New York City. So we start to see a real shift in dynamics, not only from perspective of the demographic in terms of color, but also from regional and location. We see a more of a urban perspective. So Orpheus J. Hayward, who has grown this congregation from not just a local congregation, and not even just a national congregation, but actually to an international congregation in real time. And so looking at this long history, Orpheus J. Hayward, second longest serving minister, first minister to have an online presence with the Renaissance Church of Christ, the minister that brought us into the new building, first minister with a beard, first minister to wear a purple jacket, Orpheus J. Hayward. So we see differences, but I think what's really remarkable is looking at how God works, how we see continuity. You see men, and both of these men, you see men who were educated, you see men who believed in planting churches, men who believed in scholarship, and men that even when they left West End / Renaissance, they continued in the vineyard up until their dying breath. That is a legacy from the very first minister even till our current minister, that they are continuing as they labor here in this field. So this is just a brief synopsis of the physical history of the Western Church of Christ, the personnel who have helmed the leadership mantle at the Western Church of Christ in terms of being the preacher. And I hope you can see how God's hand and how God can work with anybody. He took a defeated people, Confederates, to raise up his church in Atlanta. And then he took a group of people who the Confederates wanted subjected to them to then take over from the Confederates. Boy, if you don't see God in that, God can use anybody to do his work. Always remember, it's not about you. It's not about what you want. It's about what God and his kingdom and his son. And if you do that, it doesn't matter who's on the wall, who's a product of their time, what they thought, what they did. You keep God first, and God will give the increase. Hope this has been beneficial for you. Hope you've learned something. And I hope you can rest assured in God's grace and God's wisdom in all that he does. May God bless you.
A prayer. No, I'm so thankful for this intercession with you. Yeah, I feel like I've entered into heaven.